Well, since there was a bit of confusion in the comments after my helmet shooting video, I figured it would be good to talk a little bit about crossbows and firearms and armor to hopefully clarify a few things. So, first off, whenever I show the crossbow, there is usually some confusion as to how it performs, which is totally understandable. When you hear 350-pound draw weight, you expect an extremely powerful crossbow. However, medieval crossbows have a very short draw. Now, I made an introduction video to crossbows, which I'll link down below. I explained this in that video. I won't repeat too much from that, but in short, basically, because you draw the crossbow back only such a short distance compared to, say, a longbow, which you draw all the way, from your hand with an extended arm all the way back to your mouth. That's much more distance. So the bolt or quarrel has a lot more time to accelerate or a lot less time, I should say. The arrow has more time to accelerate compared to the bolt or quarrel. So it just cannot pick up as much velocity. So that's why a 350-pound crossbow is equivalent to about a 70 or 80-pound longbow. It's quite a difference. So you have to keep that in mind. And 70 or 80-pound bow isn't all that much. So for armor, if it's sufficiently thick, it'll hold up pretty well. If you want an armor-penetrating crossbow, we're getting more into the, say, 800-pound range. There were even ones as heavy as 1,200 pounds or even more. So for those, you would need a windlass to span them. There are different spanning methods. I don't think I mentioned all of them in the introduction video, which I should have, I guess. But you have the earliest crossbows were hand spanned. So you would just, in case of the very earliest ones, you would just step on the prod, which is the bow itself, and with your feet, and then you would just pull the thing up with just the strength of your arms and back. Then you have the goat's foot lever, which is the device that I was using. So that again hooks into the string, and then you have this long handle that provides a longer lever. So you're able to exert more force that way, and then you are able to span it with one hand, whereas even if you were to use both arms and try to pull this, you would have to be very strong to pull that. It's much easier with the goat's foot lever. And then there is also the Kranikin or Kraniquin, however you pronounce that, which is again a device that hooks onto the string. Then you have a crank that rotates horizontally and it clicks into place as you rotate. So there are notches that the device clicks into so that the string doesn't move back forward when you stop cranking. So it just goes in increments, click, 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 and then you just crank it that way. Windlass also works pretty much the same way. You have two cranks on either side, and you have a rope system that winches up. It's pretty much like a modern winch. So you wind up the rope, and thereby you slowly span the crossbow, and that's where you can handle draw weights of over 1,000 pounds. Now those would be far, far more effective at penetrating armor than this one. Now this is still the 350-pound crossbow that I have is still considered a battlefield crossbow, so it would still have been used, but it's really more against mail or ideally unarmored targets. It's really not much of an armor penetrating crossbow. Quite often, people think that crossbows were developed as a specific anti-armor weapon. But from what I understand, that's not true. Seriously, my camera really likes to mess with me. This time the battery didn't die because I replaced it right before starting the recording, but now I suddenly have a writing error on the SD card. For fluff's sake, I can't work like this. Crossbows came up very early. There's a very early example of a Greek crossbow, gastrophetes, which translates to belly bow. The way that worked is you basically span the crossbow by leaning on it. So you had a piece pushed against your belly, and you would use your entire body weight to push it down and cock it that way. And later they came up with other designs as well. The Picts had crossbows already. There's, for example, this 9th century image of a Pictish crossbow, and at that time there was no full plate armor, so they only had to deal with mail, if that. I mean, many warriors couldn't afford that, so armor piercing really wasn't the primary purpose of the crossbow at that time. And so moving on to firearms, you might think that firearms were developed specifically to defeat plate armor, but not even necessarily. I mean, the first firearms were cannon, so those were siege equipment. That's a different story. I mean, yes, it would get the job done if an armored knight was struck by a cannonball. Yeah, of course, it would do the trick, but that was not the primary purpose. And the very first crude handguns were just, I mean, they weren't super effective anyway. There was well, at least as far as I understand, it was really partially a weapon of psychological warfare, because it was new, it was scary, it was loud and smoking and belching sulfur like Satan's. I was almost going to say Satan's anus. You can't necessarily say that the attempt to deal with plate armor was the primary motivator behind the development of firearms. And in fact, armor did stand up to guns for a while. There is 17th century armor that was designed with that purpose in mind, and it was actually tested, and they had dents from bullets as proof mark, as proof that they actually could withstand musket fire. There's of course also the issue of range, because a lead round ball isn't the most aerodynamic thing in the world, and they lose velocity relatively quickly. They are still dangerous at longer range, but if you're wearing armor, there are overall a lot of factors to consider, not just with early firearms, but also with modern firearms. There's even within the same caliber, there are so many variations. I mean, for example, 45 ACP, which in this case wasn't able to penetrate, has quite a bit of variation. You can use heavier bullets, lighter bullets, more powder, less powder, different types of powder. Especially if you hand load, you can tweak it in all kinds of ways. It makes a difference whether you have a full lead bullet or a copper jacketed bullet, full metal jacket, or there's so many variations, hollow point, and this and that and the other thing. So I think you could probably come up with a 45 ACP load that would punch clean through those helmets, just like some lighter 9mm loads might not be able to. But again, the most important thing for armor penetration is really velocity. If you can get a smaller projectile accelerated to higher velocities, it's more likely to go through. So yes, you can come up with medieval or early modern steel armor that does withstand gunfire. Some gunfire. It depends dramatically on, for example, whether it's a handgun or a rifle. Rifles are always, or muskets also, long arms generally are always going to have a lot more power because of the longer barrel, which utilizes more of the pressure from the burning powder, and also they're made sturdier so they can tolerate larger amounts of powder, so more powerful explosions, if you will. And so there are lots of different variables to consider. Now, some steel armor can even withstand modern firearms, but the main problem is you need fairly thick steel for that. And that's also the kind of problem that they ran into in the Renaissance when they developed armor for use against firearms. They made it pretty heavy because they had to increase the thickness sufficiently. They actually discarded the limb armor, especially the legs, because it saves weight, and weight on the legs is very tiresome. So they would then just come up with 3/4 suits or harnesses, and that helps keep the weight down to an extent, but it is still not the most convenient thing to carry around. This may also be part of the reason for the whole stereotype that armor was super ridiculously heavy and you couldn't move in it properly and all of that. Some later armor was pretty heavy, but early medieval armor was really nowhere near as heavy as people think, and it was far easier to move in than you may think. But that's getting too tangential, so let's leave it at that. So I hope that provides a bit of extra information and context for those videos, and otherwise, thanks for watching. Hope you have a good one.